Okay, so I think we left off with Richard Francis Burton. The kind of the new era, again, in some ways going from, it's not, they overlapped a little bit, but from Livingstone in the era of the kind of the missionaries. After the Sepoy Mutiny, I mean, it's paradoxical. On the one hand, Britain is now concerned, obviously, about the sentiments of the Muslims and the Hindus and about the religious issue. On the other hand, many now are convinced that the whole point is to actually convert them. So you might call it a more aggressive, almost proselytizing type of imperialism. Again, not so much concerned with slavery, because that is now eradicated and abolished, but now you get this kind of more muscular notion of spreading Christian values. And in the late 19th century, I mean, this blends together with also definitely a larger element of cynicism to produce some of the more interesting, but also in some ways ugly episodes in imperial history. It's interesting about the British, though, because, again, you can look at it two ways. This whole issue of Christian morality, slavery, westernizing, all these questions the world is still dealing with today. When the British were, again, clamping down now a little bit more on native practices in India, there's a very famous quote, which I think gets to the heart of this whole dilemma. It was either Robert Napier, I think it was actually Sir Louis Napier. They were kind of like this great imperial dynasty, mostly soldiers. And it goes something like this. There was a practice in India, which has still not completely been abandoned today. You've probably heard of it, the funeral pyres. That is what happens when a woman's husband dies. She's put onto the fire, basically, and she's burned alive. A practice called sati. Now, I'm not going to single out any one particular cult in India, although there were certain cults that practiced this more than others. But anyway, it was practiced. I mean, this might be the equivalent of an issue today like clitoridectomy. That is, you know what I'm talking about, right? Essentially, it's sometimes called female genital mutilation. Issues like this that NGOs deal with. The British, again, they're Christians, so they don't like these practices. They want to get rid of them. On the other hand, they're native practices, right? So how do you go about it? You're ruling these native populations which have their own customs. You are, to a certain extent, exploiting them economically, at least in the sense that, like, the tax and customs revenues, obviously the British are exploiting. So you may or may not have a guilty conscience about that. On the other hand, you might also say that you are enriching the natives. This is, again, arguable with things like building the railroads and developing the economy and all this. There are all these things on the pro and the con side. But it gets really interesting when you talk about culture, right? Are the British trying to spread their values? Or are they just there to trade? Remember, in the early days, they were just there to trade. They would almost like go native. A lot of them would go native because they're far away from home, they're not with their wives, etc., etc. Now, though, their wives are there. They actually have a proper government. In fact, after 1857, I talked about the date of this mutiny, Britain decides to literally incorporate India into the British Empire. This is the era where they start to call it the Raj. R-A-J, the Raj. This is sort of the shorthand for British India once it is ruled directly by Britain. Before, again, it had been all kind of loose and indirect. And it was much larger than India is today, as large as India is. I mean, it included, all of Pakistan, parts of what is now Afghanistan, even parts of what is now Iran, along with, of course, Bangladesh. An enormous country which is now ruled directly by Britain. So that, yes, even though they don't have that many officials there, it is still now a matter of actual prestige. They are literally trying now to spread their values. Now, some of it is more innocuous. I mean, you look at things like, parliaments, obviously. A lot of parliaments around the world. This is a practice the British spread. Team sports is actually one of the more amusing of them. I mean, we all know about football. It's actually one of the funniest quotes about British imperialism. One of the last administrators to pull down the British flag, I think it was in Aden in the late 1960s, as the British Empire is winding down. He said, hundreds of years from now, all they'll remember us for is football and the expression F off. He was being, shall we say, self-deprecatory. But it is true. It's amazing. Football is played by everyone in the world now. Football was a British game. Cricket, although cricket oddly never caught on in North America? Well, it did, but then the Americans stopped playing and they started playing baseball. Cricket is, of course, still played in places. In fact, they're better at it now than like the English are. Places like Australia. Rugby, that's another big sport. Rugby, also spread by the British. The whole notion, that is, of sports and like team play, this phrase you might have heard, the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. That is that, the notions of like fitness and fair play and all of this. All of that was kind of spread. The Indians, the Pakistanis, of course, are very good at cricket too. They all picked up this stuff. On the other hand, when it gets into notions of things like relations between men and women, again, things like this practice of the funeral pyres, to bring us up to this quote, which I think is fabulous because it encompasses both the dilemmas of British imperialism, but also to a certain extent, you might say its virtues, if there are any. Supposedly, anyway, Napier, he called in a local Indian who was trying to tell him that the British, it's okay if you want to change certain things, but you should leave this practice alone because, you might disagree with it, but, this is a native practice. This is what people do. It's none of your business. And this is what Napier says. I'm not talking to you. It's not none of your business. I hope it's your business if you're, taking the class. So he says, okay, well, you tell me then that this sati is a sacred practice of yours. That what you must do when a husband dies, it is your custom. It is your custom to take the woman and put her on the funeral pyre and burn her alive. Very well, very well, very well. I should tell you, we also have a custom. And our custom is, when a man murders an innocent woman, particularly when he burns her alive, we take that man and we put a rope around his neck, and then we snap it shut and we hang him. So I tell you, why don't you go ahead? Jolly good, jolly good. Why don't you carry out your custom? And then we shall carry out ours. That was the new era, shall we say, of British imperialism. They're trying to stamp out these things. Again, with varying levels of success. And obviously a good degree of hypocrisy. That said, though, the attitude it represents, the more, shall we say, muscular attitude, some of this is also a reflection of things like material power. Now, Britain, by the 1850s and 60s, was, if we were to refer to it in 20th century terms, it was something like in the position that the United States was in after the Second World War. Now, I know people were accustomed to saying, like in the 1990s, America was now this hyperpower, superpower. Yeah, in some ways, after the fall of the Soviet Union, America's power was unrivaled when it came to things like, aircraft carriers, striking power, all of that sort of thing. Yes, but in economic terms, America will never again be as powerful as it was between about 1945 and, shall we say, the mid-1960s. Now, some of that is because this actually relates to, I'm going off on a tangent here, but it relates to these very interesting arguments about economics, the Great Depression. You might have heard the argument that the Second World War brought America out of the Great Depression because of massive government spending. There's something to that. On the other hand, if you think about it just in raw material terms, what the Second World War did was to destroy the industrial plant of most of the rest of the developed world, particularly in Europe and Japan. So that for about 20 years, America had a monopoly on things like cars, because no one else was really building them. Well, they eventually, of course, started building them again, and then America had to face competition, and that's what happened in the 1970s. American industrial power began to decline because of competition. Well, to go back to the 19th century now, by the 1850s and 60s, all of the elements of Britain's industrial revolution have kind of come together. Britain is now producing, I don't know the exact percentage, but I mean something like half of the world's steel. British trade in almost all of the major commodities is dominant. British dominates trade with Latin America, with the United States, with India, with Asia. British Navy plies the waters. You can look at some of these graphics here. You go through to graphic number 2. This is all the way up in 1913, but most of this had really been done, earlier in the 19th century. The laying of submarine cables. Various facts. By 1880, something like 100,000 miles of cable had already been laid across the world's oceans. You remember when I talked about how dramatic the Industrial Revolution is? Like we talk about today the internet like it's some exciting revolutionary thing. And yeah, in some ways it is. But all they're really doing is laying fiber optic cable across the oceans where the British, over 150 years ago, were laying the first submarine cables, first for the telegraph and then for the telephone. So British power, the British Navy controls the seas. The British are laying all of these cables, so British control global communications. You see this next map where you're looking at British Imperial naval stations. This depends on coal until the 20th century when they go over to oil. Britain, because of its lead in coal, because of its lead in steel, is able to build the warships, the ocean-going vessels. It is able to fuel them with the coal. It is able, therefore, to dominate almost all of the major trade routes. British capital, investment, is dominant in most of these places. Yeah, we tend to think again of India, or then we think of Africa. But in terms of trade, roughly half of British trade was actually with the Americas. The United States was actually the leading recipient of British direct foreign investment, followed rapidly thereafter by Latin America, which again we tend to associate with the Spanish, but the Spanish were pretty much out of the picture by like the 1820s. They still held on to Cuba pretty much. Britain dominated trade. And so when it comes to this new muscular attitude, we will now kind of enforce our values. Some of that is simply this kind of like feeling of strength and confidence. It's a little bit like how America back in its own glory days, again, which I think are gone, but its own glory days, about 50 or 60 years ago. American culture, like the Western movies, Hollywood, all of this stuff was spreading around the world. American values. American kind of way of talking, fashions, all the rest of it. It hasn't completely, gone away today, American influence. But in terms of Britain's influence, it probably would never be quite as great as it was in, again, the second half of the 19th century. There's always a bit of a lag time, though, with these things. In terms of the territorial extent of the British Empire, that was actually greatest after the First World War, even though Britain's power had really been seriously undermined, and its financial base had been undermined by the First World War. Again, paradoxically, Britain appeared more powerful than ever in like 1914 at the time of the First World War. But of course, if you looked at things like raw material indices, the Germans had already nearly caught up in things like steel. The Americans were now passing Britain, all the rest of it. Still, Britain has this moment, from roughly, shall we say, like the 1850s up until about 1900, where British power is almost unchallenged. You should notice, though, look a little bit more closely at these maps. It's kind of like the architecture of what we might call the Pax Britannica, this phrase you sometimes hear. Now, the Pax Americana is a phrase you hear regarded more recent years. This being, of course, from the old Latin for Pax Romana, the idea of the Roman Empire. If you look at where the British coaling stations are, these are the naval stations on this map, the little dots. And then you also look at the cable networks. You'll notice a couple of things. Coastlines are very important, right? Here we have cables, which have to, of course, be laid across oceans, and they have to, of course, have nodal points. So you see nodal points like at Halifax and St. John's on the path. This is kind of like in Canada, from North America up to London. You have Freetown, Lagos in what is Nigeria, Cape Town, South Africa, Durban, South Africa, then going up to Mauritius. Mauritius, very interestingly, was an island over which the British and the French fought repeatedly in the Napoleonic Wars. The movie that you saw actually on Friday, Master and Commander, it borrowed elements. It's confusing because the first novel in the series is called Master and Commander. They actually took much of the plot, though, from another novel in the series, which was about Mauritius, about the British-French battles over Mauritius, which was then, going up basically into the Indian Ocean, Australia, then from there up into Bombay. There's a lot of overlap, if you'll notice, between this map of the coaling stations. This is where the ships are going, right? They have to keep recoaling because there's only so much coal you can carry on the ships. And here, too, you see the same nodal points, right? Here again you have Lagos, Cape Town. Here again you have Aden, right? Again, I talked about Aden. That was like one of the last outposts of the British Empire to be dismantled in the 1960s. these coastal points, coastal ports and cities. This is the real essence, logistically speaking, of the British Empire. Now, if you look in terms of trade, and this is the article which I assigned for this week called The Imperialism of Free Trade. By the way, about this article, there's a much longer book, which is much more interesting, called Africa and the Victorians. This is kind of very dry and academic. I admit it's not the most exciting read, but it gets most of the important data out there. Part of what they're trying to argue with in this article is the notion that is usually associated with the Marxist theory of imperialism, going back to Hobson. Also, of course, Lenin himself wrote on imperialism, so did Rosa Luxemburg. Their notion about, kind of like surplus capital, or, once a country would saturate its internal market, or, the country needed cheaper labor, cheaper goods, you sought an outlet, both for export markets, but also, simply for maximizing profits. All of these notions that imperialism has this kind of like inexorable economic logic. Well, the argument which is made here, it's a subtle argument. You have to kind of get all the different moving parts. It's not that there was no relationship between the formal spread of empire, the spread of the British flag, say, and trade, but that the relationship was problematic and it was not linear. That, in fact, Britain traded far more with its quote-unquote indirect empire. It traded far more with the United States, for example, which was not a colony at all, of course, since 1776 or 1781, and Africa. In fact, Africa was a negligible area of British trade. If you look at your final document, I think it's the fourth in the series I gave you. This is total foreign investment, whence it came, where it went. This is kind of like a crude indicator of the volume of trade. Now you can see the UK, even as late as 1914, still dominated world trade, even though countries like France, Germany, and the US were, catching up. The US actually, incidentally, this gives you this is a very useful chart because it gives you an idea of the basic position of the US in the global economy, even to a certain extent today. The US, because it's such a huge country, its internal market has always been more important than things like exports. Whereas the UK, being a much smaller country with a smaller population, external trade was a much larger part of its own economic base. So if you look at this, okay, the biggest category here under UK is, quote, Western offshoots. US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Those are what you might call the settler countries. That is where they did not so much colonize a native population like they did in India as replace a native population. Again, partly because of things like disease, so few of the natives remained in the US. So that in a way they're just trading with themselves here. Latin America is the next biggest category. Latin America, which is to say everything pretty much south of Texas. Central America, South America. That is the next largest category. The third largest category then is Asia. Again, primarily India, but not only India. You also have places like Hong Kong, Singapore, other of the European colonies, areas like Indonesia. Africa is it's not negligible. By this point, Britain has an enormous empire in Africa, but even so, again, it mostly represents, let's say, 2 out of 18, so that's about 1/9. It's like 10% max. And this is in 1914. Until 1880, it was virtually negligible. Some of this trade reflected commodities like gold and diamonds, the mines of Kimberley in South Africa. A lot of it represented Egypt, now that Britain had been there for a while. But the question that if Africa was not really terribly important, and it was not economically, you look for these other countries, the US, its own trade with Africa, it doesn't even show up here. It's negative, or zero, basically. Other European countries, again, maybe 5-10%. The Germans, maybe 5%. France, maybe 10%. And France, remember, had an enormous African empire. So if Africa was not economically important, which evidently it was not, why did you have this phenomenon called the scramble for Africa? I mean, literally, in the course of about 20 years, almost the entire continent of Africa was colonized by Europeans. This is what people refer to usually when they're talking about the classical age of imperialism. Roughly 1882 to about 1900. really less than 2 decades. Nearly all of it happens. You get the British obviously taking over Egypt, the British then moving down eventually into all these places like Sudan, Kenya, Uganda. There's also Nigeria. The French, who had already been in North African places like Algeria, the French fan out. They take West Africa, Senegal, Niger, Chad, later Madagascar, Morocco. They're already, of course, in Tunisia, Algeria. The Germans, I'll talk about them in a moment because they're the strangest case of all. They take these places like Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, East Africa, the Cameroons. The Belgians famously take over the Congo, King Leopold. The Belgians are probably the worst imperialists of all. They were particularly cruel and rapacious, and they just looted the place, basically. They were horrible. All of this happens like at once. It's like part of the same phenomenon. I mean, what caused it? As late as something like, I think, 1875, less than 10% of Africa had been colonized. Whereas by 1900, there's like virtually nothing left. Like there were these odd diplomatic disputes right before the First World War. The most notorious of them, the so-called Agadir incident of 1911. This is when the Sultan of Morocco is beset with a kind of rebellion of some of the native tribes. He's already financially dependent on the French. Probably, I don't remember whether his bodyguard, but some of his troops obviously are French. He asked the French to send in reinforcements to help him defend his throne. The French do this. It kind of like disturbs the other powers because it seems like the French are actually going to directly make a claim on Morocco. So the Germans send a warship, and then the Italians make these claims. All of these kind of bizarro things are happening over a seemingly rather not terribly important country. And the Germans then say, look, we want compensation, and then they kind of scratch their heads, but we've already taken the rest of Africa. Like, there's nothing left, There are some tropical marshes in the middle of the continent nobody wants, and that's all that's left by 1911. So how and why did it happen? Well, it's not that hard to say how it started. Basically, it starts with the occupation of Egypt in 1882. Now, this in itself, in a way, is more a part of Ottoman history than it is of proper sort of West European history, although they're beginning to come together, of course, in the Eastern question. The Ottomans, I guess I really haven't covered this that thoroughly yet, but the Ottomans in 1875 had declared not bankruptcy per se. What they did, it was sort of a partial default. But then no one ever actually declares bankruptcy when it comes to governments. They usually say a little bit like like the Greeks recently. Well, we'll pay back our bondholders, but maybe not as much as they're asking. Like let's say you knock it down to like 50 cents on the dollar or something. In this case, it was like roughly half. They basically just said we're not going to pay back the full amount that we owe. What always happens in this case, of course, is then the interest rates go up, your creditors cry foul, and of course in the modern era you get things like the IMF and the World Bank coming in. In that era, you didn't get that. You just got these consortiums of European diplomats and bankers hashing out behind closed doors what would happen. So this is when the Ottomans declare bankruptcy. And in fact, to a certain extent, this is the direct predecessor of the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-8. There are other things going on, like in the Balkans, with the Bulgarian rebellion, and the Serbs and the Montenegrins declare war, etc., etc. But the background to all of this is that the Ottomans are now essentially sort of bankrupt and dependent on the European powers. Particularly, you get this thing called the Caisse de la Dette Ottomane. Basically, the public debt administration. The Europeans, with the decree of Muharrem in 1881, they actually take over most of the customs revenues of the Ottoman Empire. Things like the tolls, the tariffs, even things like the salt tax, taxes on commodities. The Europeans begin collecting the taxes. They're running most of the post offices. To a very large extent, for all of his kind of pretensions at independence, Sultan Abdul Hamid II is never really fully sovereign because of this. Now, the same basic thing happens in Egypt. In Egypt, it's a kind of partial bankruptcy leading to a crisis, various rebellions. The government is weak. The Khedive, as it's usually called in shorthand, Egypt had, of course, been really not formally independent, but for all intents and purposes independent of the Ottomans, going back to the time of Mehmet Ali, as you call him, Cavallala, because of, again, its, at that time, actually, it had even a superior army to what the Ottomans had. Some of it is because of French influence, going back to Napoleon's invasion. It's the French who mostly build the Suez Canal, which is completed in 1869. So it's not just the British that are there. In fact, that's the thing to remember, is that Egypt, again, part of the Ottoman Empire, at least in some kind of legal sense, but not really directly ruled anymore by the Ottomans. Egypt is an area which all of the powers now have a claim on because all of them hold debts there. Just like in the Ottoman Empire, although it's the Russians who eventually invade, all of the powers have these diplomats basically making demands on the Ottoman government because almost all of them are bondholders. They have a stake in the debt. The same thing is true of Egypt. It's particularly true of the French. The French have this kind of cultural influence claim, going back to Napoleon's time. Mehmet Ali was almost like a French protege, Cavalla. The British, they have investment there too. They hold a lot of the bonds. But in the end, the British are the ones who decide to move. Partly because I think they had more force available in the theater, but also because of the peculiarities of British politics. Gladstone and Disraeli haven't really talked that much about the Tories versus the Liberals. But what you had, this strange and almost like directly parallel divide in British politics, going back to the Crimean War. The Tories, the Conservatives, tended to be, because they were imperial-minded, they were very concerned about India, they tended to be anti-Russian. That is, they were mostly concerned about the Russian threat, as in the Crimean War. The idea that Britain's ultimate competitor, its rival for world power, was the Russians. Therefore, the Ottomans, it's not that they particularly admired them or liked them, but they saw them as useful. They were a useful sort of like a bulwark. They were a useful, almost like a wall to hold back the spread of Russian influence into possibly the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It seems a bit odd, India being very far, of course, from Istanbul, but they kind of thought the two things were related. Now, the Liberals, for various peculiar reasons, which mostly have to do with Gladstone himself, who was like party leader for 20 or 30 years, they tended to be weirdly pro-Russian, which I have never completely understood myself. But the anti-Turkish part is not that hard to figure out. It went along with this thing I was talking about in terms of imperialism, morality, and slavery. It's this liberal Christian notion, that is, of good governance, but also of making moral judgments. Gladstone makes his really big name in the 1870s denouncing Ottoman repression in the Balkans. He writes this pamphlet called The Bulgarian Horrors. So he basically says, look, the time has come to kind of take over Ottoman affairs. They can't govern themselves. He has all these famous phrases, like he calls the Turks the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. He didn't like Turks very much, as you can imagine. So he gets up on his moral high horse, and quietly, again, it's confusing because you wouldn't think Britain would want Russia to invade the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, that's what Gladstone's opponents, they basically say, look, you're like a tool of the Russians. The Russians will just use this as an excuse. And Gladstone just kind of like smiles and changes the subject. But in a way, that's kind of what the Russians were doing. The Russians were like the enforcer, trying to force the Ottomans to accept these European terms. In fact, that was literally the justification the Russians used for invading in the Russo-Ottoman War. It was that the Ottomans did not accept all of the conditions that the European powers were insisting on, things like rights for the Christians, various privileges for the Armenians in the provinces of Eastern Anatolia, etc., etc. The Russians are sort of like the battering ram. But all of the European powers have now begun to make certain demands and impositions on the Ottoman Empire. Now, in the case of Egypt, Russia was not really directly involved. There was mostly a matter of British and French influence. The Germans they're sort of like involved behind the scenes. Bismarck, who I introduced last week, Bismarck has a fascinating role in all of this. During the Russo-Ottoman War, in fact, directly before it, he coins one of his most famous kind of aphorisms when he talks about the notion of the Balkans. That's how it's usually quoted. In fact, he was talking about the Orient, by which he meant the Ottoman Empire, is, quote, not worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier, not worth the bones of a Prussian soldier. So he's trying to say Germany has no interest in the Ottoman Empire. Now, he would later change this policy somewhat. I'll go more into the German-Ottoman policy because it's very important for the First World War in the coming weeks. But he changes it to the extent that he sees that the other powers are interested in the Ottoman Empire, and so Germany has to figure out what to do about this. Germany does not want a war to happen over the Ottoman Empire because Germany is now surrounded by potential enemies. The French, remember, resent the Germans. The Russians on the other side. The Russians particularly resent the Germans after the Russo-Ottoman War because, Bismarck basically tells them to stand down. They have a deal where they're going to have a large puppet state in Bulgaria, the so-called San Stefano Bulgaria. The Germans force them to back down. I'll go into all of this when we look at the Eastern question. But for now, Bismarck develops an attitude, first regarding the Ottoman Empire, which he then transfers to Africa. He sees it as, on the one hand, dangerous that the European powers have these rivalries. On the other hand, it could be useful. Because, after all, if the British and the French are fighting with each other over African colonies, that will keep them from teaming up against Germany in Europe. Is there a question? So we have one of the other famous Bismarck quotes. The quote which to a certain extent encapsulated this whole business about the scramble for Africa. To go back, England makes the move, right? They're the ones who occupy Egypt, theoretically, again, on behalf of the powers, to make sure Egypt pays its debts, pays its bondholders, stays basically stable, so there isn't a meltdown in civil war, so that the Suez Canal is secure and safe, etc., etc. This, of course, annoys the French, and so they demand compensation. Then the Belgians want compensation. This whole process gets going, where the European powers start to conquer African countries, really, for no other reason than that the other powers are doing it. It's almost like a kind of junior high school politics. He said, she said, you're doing that, and so we're going to do this. In some cases, there was economic motivations. The Belgians definitely milked Congo for all it was worth. But to get back to Bismarck, he finally gets together, and he's the one who sort of like arranges some of these little compromises. He doesn't want to resolve the problems, but what he does want to do is to encourage the other powers to do all this. As he puts it, and I think he actually said this to a British explorer who came into his office. And I wish I had a map here, but all you really need is a map of Europe. Okay, so Bismarck takes out a map of Europe. Remember that, Europe. And he says, here is my map of Africa. Okay, so it's literally untrue. It's a map of Europe. It's not a map of Africa. He says, here is my map of Africa. Okay? Here is France. Here is Russia. And here is Germany. That is my map of Africa. Okay, so what did that mean? That meant that for Bismarck, for the Germans, the basic question was, for Germans, national interests, strategy, security, etc., keeping France and Russia from teaming up, probably with British help, to encircle and surround the Germans. So the best way of doing that would be by somehow convincing the Russians that Germany supported their ambitions in the Ottoman Empire while keeping the French distracted. He knew the French would never forgive Germany for the Franco-Prussian War. That was impossible. They had humiliated France, taken French territory. But he thought that if he could encourage the powers to all get involved in Africa, ideally even the Russians, although as it turned out the Russians weren't really interested, then they would basically keep squabbling with one another and they wouldn't team up against Germany. Bismarck, again, his policies are not really followed by his successors. He was in some ways too much of a kind of a clever genius in the sense that he basically understood that Germany had no real interest in Africa. In fact, the oddest part of his whole story is that Germany takes over these colonies, which the Germans really had no interest in. In fact, Bismarck himself had no interest in them. He signed off on German colonization of Africa. Essentially, it wasn't as a joke, but it was as a way of allowing the Germans to organize a conference so that the other European powers could be kept busy in Africa. He wasn't serious. He didn't mean it. A lot of Germans, though, didn't get the joke. A lot of Germans actually started forming these things like, pan-colonial leagues, where they got really excited about going to Africa. Although, as it turned out, most colonists didn't really want to go to Africa. Why not? Because the weather was horrible. No one really wanted to go there. In fact, that's one of the reasons the Germans eventually decided that it made a lot more sense to pursue a kind of alliance with the Ottoman Empire to expand their influence there, was because no Germans actually wanted to go to Africa. Now, as to why the British did all this, I think the most interesting document we have this week, it's a curious map, because it actually does date to a later period of the British Empire, the period right before the Second World War. You remember the map of where all of those coastal kind of nodal checkpoints were, right? All of these port cities the British used for coaling stations and then for cable stations. You put these maps next to each other, or just look at them in sequence. Like take the map of the cable network. You'll notice these cables are, of course, all lying underneath the oceans, right? There are no cables going across Africa. There really aren't a lot of communications going across Africa. Because, as I said, again, this is not a pleasant fact, but Africa didn't matter a whole lot economically to Britain or to anyone else. Yes, eventually they did discover things like gold and diamonds down in the Kimberley mines of South Africa, Rhodesia. Yes, that's true. But for the most part, basically Africa was a way station on the way to India. Okay, so you have two key points. Well, three really. I mean, Lagos, Freetown over on the west coast, which is important particularly for these cables which have to go around the long route. And then you have, of course, Aden, Alexandria, basically Cairo, and then Cape Town in the south. That's what matters to Britain. Then you look at this map of the countries they colonized. It's really kind of curious. Egypt is kind of like run off the top here. But basically, they just conquered everything in between Egypt and South Africa. They conquered them all in this peculiar sequence, where what would basically happen was, they would have some problems with the tribes of the Sudan, such as like the Mahdi rebellion in the 1880s, which famously, they take Gordon Pasha and, they kill him sword in hand, and then later on Kitchener goes down and the so-called, the butcher of Khartoum, and he takes care of the rebels. Eventually, some of this is also because the French are getting involved in all this area which borders it. But eventually, Sudan becomes unstable, and so they move down into Uganda and Kenya. Tanganyika, which they take later from the Germans, at the time it was like split between the Germans and the British. There was like a little ragged line of British influence running down. And then from the south, the same thing. Like they have trouble, remember, with the Boers in South Africa, the Boer War of the 1890s. These are actually Dutch settlers. They have problems with some of the tribes up in Bechuanaland. They do discover, some economic resources in what is later Rhodesia. But essentially, they just figure that in order to secure this point and that point, they have to conquer everything in between, which is pretty much what they do. Like if you actually look at the sequence of how it happens in the 1880s and 90s, there's this phrase you sometimes hear that the British Empire was, quote, conquered in a fit of absence of mind. That is, that it was done like unintentionally and accidentally. It's not true for the most part. But when it comes to Africa, in a way, it kind of is true. They never really intended to colonize most of these countries. It happened by this kind of mysterious process where they were increasingly concerned first about Egypt and its security in the Suez Canal, and then later about Sudan, and that brought them south. And then when it came to South Africa, they were concerned about the Boers, the settlers, then about some of the tribes to the north, like the Zulus. And so eventually they went north. And eventually they just kind of randomly met up. There was no plan. It wasn't pretty. It was not an episode, I don't think, of which the British could possibly be proud, or of course should be proud. In fact, the best phrase that I've heard to describe this whole era of British imperialism, it's actually in the book which is based on this article I have you read by Robinson and Gallagher. They talk about a, quote, hardening of arteries and hardening of hearts, which is to say, the British were no longer really even pretending to be that interested in this whole notion of Christianizing the heathens and so on and so forth. In fact, the real symbol of this era later on, there are a couple of poems about it, was the Maxim gun. As the phrase went, basically, we will win and they will not because we have the Maxim and they have not. This was, of course, one of the earliest machine guns, repeating rifles. There was also a particularly lethal rifle called the Peabody Martini, which was particularly lethal at long range. With these weapons, the British were able to win, with various kind of punitive expeditions. At one point, the Emperor of Abyssinia, or as we call him today, Ethiopia, took a couple of British subjects, hostage and put them in jail. The British sent a small army of a couple of hundred men, dispatched from India, and they basically put paid to the Abyssinian Empire. There were other episodes. The Battle of Rorke's Drift was, I think, the most notorious, and that was when these 4 Britons were surrounded by an army of 2,000, and they beat them off because they didn't have the Maxim, but they had the Peabody Martini rifle, and the others did not. What they basically did was, they set up like a primitive square with like sandbags, and they just held off one assault after another. I mean, it was the time really of, I think, the most extreme difference between Western power and that of the rest of the world. This was true even in China, which was, although it was not colonized in the same way as Africa was. Obviously, China was an older, more ancient civilization. In China, the issue was trade, as they called it, freeing up China, or the open door, the different powers, they all wanted to trade there. Britain had fought various wars over this in the 1840s and 50s, sometimes called the Opium Wars. Opium was not the only issue in the wars, but it was certainly one of them. The basic shtick the Europeans used was, again, keeping the markets open. So they would fight wars with China to almost force the Chinese to open their own market. And the Chinese eventually rebelled. This was the so-called Boxer Rebellion of, shorthand, call it 1900, which was, of course, suppressed with brutality. There's a story about this era in Shanghai history. I'm not sure if it's actually true. But supposedly, it kind of shows, again, the vast difference in power and prestige between the Europeans and the others. They would have, different shops and restaurants. Supposedly, some of them would have a sign, "No dogs or Chinamen allowed." That is, you can't bring in your dogs, and you also can't bring any natives. I don't know if that's actually true. I think that's one of those stories that sounds kind of too clever to be true. But there was an element of that. The Europeans set up these trading colonies, very well protected, obviously very wealthy, very rich, deeply resented by the natives. I mean, a lot of kind of modern rancor in politics goes back to this whole era, kind of the late 19th century. There's a phrase, I think I introduced it the first week, Hesperophobia, loosely translated fear and loathing of the West. Although oddly, it tends not to be as true in places like Africa, where Western influence to some extent is actually appreciated or even welcomed at times and in places. But definitely in places like China. Obviously places like the Middle East, places that had their own histories which felt beleaguered and put upon in this era of really dominant European power. Because the Europeans are dominant in every way now. They're dominant strategically. The British are at the lead, but even behind them, the other European powers have almost the same, it almost seems like magic powers. They show up in these places with repeating rifles, machine guns, modern medicines, books, all the rest of this stuff that a lot of the natives just have no answer to. So there's an extreme disconnect now between the power of the European countries and the rest of the world. And obviously some of the resentments of places like China go back specifically to this era. In the case of the European powers themselves, you can definitely look back on this. There's a famous novel by Joseph Conrad called The Heart of Darkness. Have any of you heard of the novel, Heart of Darkness? Supposedly, this novel was actually the inspiration for that old Marlon Brando movie, Apocalypse Now, from the late 1970s, set in the kind of Vietnam War era, where they transplanted it, about basically it's supposedly it's a journey into the darkest heart of imperialism, in the sense that the British began to see some of what they were doing, and they began to feel, you might say almost like guilty about it. Not that they were necessarily willing to abandon it. But some people have looked at this and they said, the real symbolism here is that what the Europeans were now doing in terms of, dominating the world, getting into all these fights and rivalries, they were in some ways just transferring, a little bit like in the Cold War, you had like proxy wars. They're transferring their own conflicts to places like China, India, Africa, the Americas. In some ways, just as Bismarck saw, as a way of preventing them from fighting one another back at home. But a lot of kind of, shall we say, stored tension and energy was there, because after all, the Europeans are perfecting all of these weapons. They are perfecting things like communication systems, logistics, warships, coal-fired warships, which now have ranges of hundreds of miles, and then eventually, once they're recalled, hundreds more miles. They can make it all the way around the world. They, of course, have more destructive force than ever before. It's often said that the European armies, at least until the modern era, the only really thing they had to fear was other European armies. But if you look closely at the few wars of this period which did see Europeans fighting other Europeans, as opposed to fighting lightly armed natives, certain battles of the Crimean War, like the Siege of Sevastopol, where the casualty figures were just absolutely wretched. The American Civil War, battles like Gettysburg, casualties in the hundreds of thousands. The first few encounters between, steel, that is metallic battleships, or where a metallic battleship would encounter a wooden one and just essentially obliterate it. There were signs, you might say, of the kind of storm brewing, the catastrophe to come. Because once the Europeans were no longer able to export their own conflicts and tensions to what a later age would call the Third World, although the term did not exist yet, towards specifically places like Africa and China. Once, that is, the conflicts came back to Europe, of course, all of these techniques of modern warfare that they had been mastered were now unleashed upon themselves. So you might say, in a way, that the heart of darkness was in Europe itself. So that is all I have to say today. If you haven't read it, please do check out the Robinson Gallagher article, The Imperialism of Free Trade. Again, it's dry, but I think it's important because it explains a lot about the real economics of both imperialism but also free trade in the 19th century.